A very good morning to everyone. Welcome to this event where we're going to talk about the right to housing. Housing as a human right and not a commodity. And if you would like, please move forward so we can have a bit of a more intimate dialogue. We will be using the mics because it's streaming, although we're not full. A special welcome to Leilani Farha, who is the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to adequate housing. You can wonder, why has WeAffect invited Leilani to Sweden? Because we, in our development cooperation, work with cooperative housing and see that the situation facing our partner organizations around the world is increasingly the same as the challenges that we are seeing in Sweden. So in order to discuss that, we've invited Leilani and also Fredrik Gerten, who has made a documentary about one aspect of the global housing crisis, and that's what we're going to talk about. But welcome, Leilani.
Thank you.
And maybe I'll ask you to start with, we're going to see the film Push, or we're going to see bits of it and discuss that. But maybe start by saying, what exactly is a special rapporteur? What do you do?
The media calls me a global watchdog, which is not a very friendly term, but I suppose it means that I spend my time traveling the world and trying to determine whether people are actually enjoying their right to housing. And there's a very simple definition of what that means. It simply means, are people living in dignity, with dignity, and in security? Are they threatened with eviction? Are they finding their housing so unaffordable that they might not be able to pay rent and then have to leave? Are they living in an informal settlement that's being upgraded and then possibly being evicted? Are they living on resource-rich land where the extractive industries may displace them? So my job is to monitor whether people are enjoying security and dignity in their housing. But at the same time, my role is to make sure governments are doing what they're supposed to be doing to ensure dignity and security. So holding them to their international human rights obligations, because governments like Sweden, for example, have signed and ratified a lot of international human rights law that protects the right to housing. So my task is also to meet with governments when I travel and have that discussion with them. What could they be doing better? What could they be doing more? And what does the right to housing actually mean? Because while they sign and ratify this law, they don't always know what it actually means to implement it. So I do a variety of things. I go around to countries 2 a year, and I do in-depth explorations. I do unofficial visits to cities, many throughout the year. I write thematic reports to clarify the meaning of the right to housing. And I write rather formal legal letters to governments to tell them that they're on notice for potentially violating the right to housing.
Which you have done to the government of Sweden.
I have. Mm-hmm. Particularly on the issue that the film Push covers, this issue of the uber commodification of housing, where housing's used as a vehicle to grow wealth or a financial instrument rather than interacted with as home.
I think last night we had a screening of this documentary Push, which is the first, I don't know if we call it a sneak preview screening in Sweden. And I thought let's have a look at some clips and we can comment them directly.
Yeah, I've written lyrics. Me and my cousin have made a song for it. Rest in peace to the fallen from Grenfell. My heart's with all of their families. We have to stay strong for Grenfell. We can't fall apart from this tragedy.
That community is special to me because it's well grown up. But people will be forced out.
They try and push us out. The community is strong. We put foot down. We stand together, our voice sings loud. There ain't no
I guarantee I'll stay here. I'll fight with everything that I've got and I'll fight for the other people.
Rest in peace to the fallen from Grenfell. My heart's with all of their families. We have to stay strong for Grenfell. We can't fall apart from this tragedy.
You have human rights obligations, and you can't let these investors and the financial system run amok on its own.
I say, wow, human rights. Every single person has a bunch of rights. And then I have a question for you. And that is, are you a legal scholar on human rights? Do you just,
Yes,
okay.
yes,
So
that's right.
You have the instrumentality that is the law.
Exactly.
Because what I see is those with power, boy, can they deploy the law in ways that work for them. Stuff is happening, you know?
Yeah.
Prices go up in a neighborhood that is fixed. That's one thing. Everybody understands that part. And then they should understand that at that point, another actor might come into the picture. A monster that nobody can see, that nobody really understands, whose language is incomprehensible. And then they can maybe be curious and say, let me check out that monster. Who is this monster actually? What is happening here?
I don't believe that capitalism itself is hugely problematic. Is unbridled capitalism in an area that is a human right problematic? Yes. And I think that's what differentiates housing as a commodity from gold as a commodity. Gold is not a human right. Housing is.
This building, this whole complex has 1,700.
1,700. Wow.
Yeah, 1,700 units.
Wow.
The previous landlords, I think it was CNC. I think they did put information up to let us know that the complex was going to be sold.
Right.
But this is before Fairfield came in.
Do you know who is Fairfield? I don't know who they are.
From what I'm told, Fairfield is a subsidiary of is it Blackstone?
Right. Private equity firm.
Yes, exactly. They want to raise each apartment the rent up to like $900 each. That is
By $900 each.
by $900.
And are you going to be able to pay that?
I don't know. I mean, I can definitely say next year there's no way. And where I'm going to go, I don't have a clue. I don't know.
Right. And do you mind me asking, are you employed?
Yes, I am.
Yeah. And so what percentage of your income would this be, 25.84?
90%.
90%.
About 90. I'll say. All right. Yeah. 90%.
Right. And do you consider that affordable for you?
Oh no, it's not.
Yeah.
If it goes to 3,400, then I have to be making six figures. I have to make at least $100,000 a year.
Wow.
There's days I'm optimistic, but then there's some days I'm more.
I think human rights law hasn't caught up. And it worries me that I haven't quite yet found the language. Because people are now coming to me more and more and wanting me to talk about it. But how do we describe it in a way that will make sense, resonate, and really get at that issue? I'm looking for that. I feel a little bit desperate about that. So maybe I need to keep talking to the people in the financial field.
Okay. Leilani, in this clip and throughout the movie, you talk about housing, as a basic human right, also not being recognized by many as a human right. Here in Almedalen, in several seminars, we see that we're talking about oh, it's social good or social rights or etc. But I don't think we've met anybody who actually says housing is a basic human right. In the clip, you talk about that human rights obligations are twisted to serve interests and so on. Can you elaborate a bit on that?
Did I say that? Well, in the clip I say that international human rights law hasn't sort of caught up. And I think what I meant is that there's this new phenomenon now documented in PUSH that hasn't been grappled with or understood from the point of view of human rights. So it's been allowed to happen at a furious pace in the last 8 years without any kind of regard for what it means for those people whose rights are most in peril. So it tends to be low-income people, vulnerable populations, single mothers, people with disabilities, migrants, refugees. Those are the people, indigenous peoples, those are the people for whom human rights are so incredibly important because they're the most vulnerable populations, vulnerable to having their rights violated. And yet this beast, financialization as we call it, has come in without human rights sort of turning its gaze. I think, you know, my predecessor in the role of rapporteur started to turn her gaze to it and is now also working on this issue. And I've turned my attention to it, but the human rights system as a whole hasn't. So governments are not being held accountable. And it's governments that are allowing this to happen. It's not happening on its own. People talk about the market as if it has a life of its own, like as if it's a live entity. It may be an animal of sorts, but it's created and supported by state laws, policies, and regulatory frameworks.
Mm-hmm. In the clip, and we'll see more about it just now, but the company Blackstone is mentioned. Who is Blackstone?
Sorry, still having early morning voice. Blackstone is the largest private equity firm in terms of its residential real estate holdings in the world. So what is a private equity firm? Private equity firm is a corporation that takes other people's money, pension fund money, money from individuals of ultra high net worth, insurance company money, bank money from banks, and invests it in what they believe to be lucrative assets. Residential real estate is considered an alternative asset class with an incredibly high return rate. So it is a investment of choice because of that high return rate over a short period of time, I should say. So private equity firms are looking for the quick in and the quick out. So they tend to go in with their huge sums of money, and we're talking about unprecedented amounts of money at their disposal. They go in, invest, and they hope to get a quick turnaround, normally in and out within 5 years. So that's sort of who they are. They are operating globally. I keep saying all roads lead to Blackstone. Every time I hear about almost every time I hear about a building being sold, people being evicted, rents increasing, Blackstone seems to be at the heart of it. They actually created the model that other asset management firms like Achilles here use. So they are dominant in the field. And I should say that they only got into residential real estate at the time of the global financial crisis. So they basically have preyed on the misfortune of others buying up cheap debt or what's called bad debt. So the financial ruin of families has resulted in the incredible wealth of Blackstone and its investors. They bought up all of those foreclosed mortgages in the United States, in Ireland, and in Spain. And they are, I believe they're the largest single landlord in the world at the moment.
Yes, and an increasingly important actor in Sweden as well. Should we go on and see the second clip?
Oh.
When you look at the political classes, which I hold responsible in part for a lot of the extremes that we have reached in terms of extracting value so that all our governments now are poorer than they were in the 1980s when this sort of begins. The value of all real estate that functions as an asset is $217 trillion. That's more than global GDP of all the countries in the world, of all the economies in the world. So you know that you're dealing with something that exits the domain of what we would call money. They're highly camouflaged extractions because they come in the shape of extraordinarily complex instruments that nobody who's not in that business can understand. The political classes, instead of doing their homework and saying, aha, we've left traditional banking, we could all understand that, something else has happened. It's so complex that we delegate to the experts. Who are the experts? It's the financial sector itself.
You said in the first clip that you feel desperate. Do you still feel desperate?
I'm feeling less desperate as Push, the film, gets out there and people are talking about this, so I feel I'm starting to have some company. For quite some time, it was Frederick Gerten and I going back and forth and trying to understand this beast, and then meeting with Saskia Sassen and getting some more intel from her, and then a little bit from Stiglitz. And, you know, it's been a bit of a lonely road, I would say. I feel a little less desperate because people are starting to talk about it. I think we still haven't wrestled it down. I'm still learning things. When I hear Saskia say, you know, we've exited the domain of money, and that the political classes haven't done their homework. Like, I know what the words mean. I'm not sure I feel the depth of it or completely understand the depth of it. I know it's huge because I can feel the heaviness and the desperation of tenants with whom I'm meeting all the time. But to say that we've exited the domain of money, or to talk about it's $163 trillion, 217 trillion. 217 trillion is the value of all real estate. And of that, 75% is the value of residential real estate. So residential real estate is the biggest business in the world. But when we say $163 trillion, do you know what that means?
No.
No. Does anyone in the room know what in the tent know what that means? No, of course not. It's like an uber amount of money that we have no capacity to comprehend. So the work has that quality to it of like a little bit like sand through my hands. Sort of, I get it, and then and then I lose it again.
You speak also in the film about that it's actually not rocket science. And I think I've heard you speak at other seminars here in Almedalen and in the film. Many people are surprised by the message. There's an initial, if not questioning, but it's like, oh, we didn't know this. Why are these political actors not doing their homework?
I think the political actors know what's going on. They're part of it. Excuse me. There's no way, for example, Donald Trump doesn't know what's going on. He himself is a real estate mogul, as they say. His chief economic advisor was... there's water right here. Sorry. His chief economic advisor when he first became president was Schwartzman, who was the CEO of Blackstone. So I think that governments know I think residential real estate is a huge part of economies. Of course. And I think it's really hard to disembed residential real estate from a government sense of the economy. So it's very hard to challenge. It's sort of why thanks. Multiple ways of dealing with a scratchy throat.
Rest. I'll say that also to take action and to get politicians and other powerful actors to not only start listening but to act. You have started the initiative that is called The Shift. And maybe we could elaborate a bit about that when you've sucked on your mint for a minute or two.
Yeah.
And also talk about how development actors are starting to work together under the framework of The Shift.
Yeah.
But what we could do is actually do the third film clip and we can take it all in one. What do you say?
Sure.
Yeah?
Oh my God, you're so loud.
All right, you sure?
No, we're splitting it. Yeah, you don't need to open two. Did you shake it?
Yes, I shook it. That is not half.
Okay, whoever pours it, the other person has to drink it.
No, I'm putting some back.
Okay, that's gonna have a big disaster. I'm getting out of the way. You guys better go.
How's it going?
Fine. So that chart, did you go directly to the chart?
Yeah.
In the Greater Toronto Area, for example, in the last 30 years, housing prices have increased by 425%, whereas in a similar 30-year period, average family income has only grown by 133%. So something else is in play, and clearly it's not the economic fundamentals, as you can see from the above graph.
So are you going to send this around or what?
No, I don't know. I would need to check the numbers first, but it's pretty, I mean, it's pretty grim. I think we are at an incredibly urgent moment. The extent to which we're seeing urbanization collide with stagnant wages and a lack of affordability is unprecedented. So you have like poor people really struggling now, like never before. But then you also have the middle class unable to afford to live in cities and provide the services that are necessary for a city. I don't want to overuse the word crisis, but it suggests a crisis. So then we start asking, wait a second, who's going to live in cities? Who are cities for? It's not rocket science, you know? What do we think people need to have a dignified life? And it's clear that decent housing, affordable housing, is one of those things. And it's supported by international law.
Kennedy Heights family is just hours away from learning whether or not they can stay in their home or be forced out onto the streets.
Problem? Housing is gobbling up more of shrinking paychecks.
People in 59 out of 102 countries worldwide would need to save their yearly income for at least 10 years in order to buy a house in their country.
There are two histories, we might say, that intersect today in that space that we call the city. And one of them is a familiar issue, which is for which we have used the term gentrification. When I hear people today saying it's gentrification, one reaction, an ironic reaction, is if only. It's much deeper than that. It's much more foundational.
In the movie, it's a fantastic movie. It goes up on the cinemas in Sweden on 8 September, I think. There are many examples. 6 September. There are many examples of people in dire situations and need. And I think when we talk about global housing crisis, maybe those are the kind of pictures we're used to seeing, slum dwellers or etc. But when it comes to financialization, that I can't even pronounce, it's also an increasing problem. It is in Sweden. Do you want to elaborate a bit about the situation here and what you wrote in your letter?
Sure. I mean, truth be told, I haven't studied Sweden extensively, but you don't need to do too much research to figure out what's happening here. Blackstone is here, not in that name. They form subsidiary companies. I think there must be tax advantages to doing so, and I think it's a way to get around some other regulatory frameworks. But in any event, they establish subsidiary companies, and they've done so here, and they're eating up your affordable housing stock. So it's that simple. They move in. This is the business model I haven't really described for you, repeated the world over by other private equities and asset management firms. They survey the land and they find out where people are living in affordable units. That is, units that are affordable to the households living there, and that Blackstone has figured out through algorithms and other digital processes, they can extract more wealth off of the property, squeezing more dollars out of every square meter. So they then purchase the building. They do modest renovations. They engage in other activities that threaten the tenants or make tenants uncomfortable, and tenants start leaving. They either self-evict because the circumstances are so horrible, or they self-evict because they know that in a few months' time they won't be able to pay their rent, or they are evicted for arrears, lack of payment of rent. And from there, where will people go is the question. And in most cases, they've got nowhere to go because there is no other affordable housing. That's often why people are living in kind of slightly crappy places. It's affordable and crappy, but they can't afford anywhere else that's better. So in Sweden, I visited a community in Uppsala that was facing this, and I spoke, and you'll see in the movie when you see the film, I spoke with a single mother who was in the midst of this, watching this happening to her community. And these are often people who've been living in their communities for quite some time. And I mean, it can be devastating for people. So, as I said, I haven't done thorough tracking in Sweden, but I certainly have in other places. And for example, I was out in San Francisco about a year and a half ago, and I met several people, but one woman sticks out in my mind. She'd been working at a medical clinic, and racialized woman, African American. She'd been working at a medical clinic. She was a technician of some sort, a decent job. She'd been living in an apartment in San Francisco. She was paying just over $1,000 US per month, and she had no real problem making ends meet. Her building was bought by an asset management firm. She didn't know which one. And they immediately raised the rent an astronomical amount, a third of her rent, so 33%. And she simply couldn't afford it. She managed to stay there for a few months, and then it became she was falling into arrears, and she just didn't have the money. So she moved out, and she didn't have anywhere to go because the cost of a 2-bedroom apartment in San Francisco on a monthly is about $4,500 average rent, $4,500. She couldn't afford $1,200 or $1,300. So she couch surfed with friends and family members for a while. Then she wanted to move in with her sister, but her sister couldn't take her in because the sister had taken in the mother, who was in similar circumstances. So this woman, I met her living in a tent under a highway in California, in San Francisco. And just to give you the full picture, California has the 6th largest GDP in the world, the state of California. So these are the realities. So when I talk about this as an urgent issue, it is a life and death matter. Her life expectancy has now lowered because she's living on the streets, lowered dramatically. So what worries me about Sweden is, what path are you on? And what is government doing to protect all these vulnerable families? That's, So I did write to the government of Sweden, and their response was what I would call pithy. I wrote to a number of governments at the same time, and I wrote to Blackstone. And of those who responded, the only government that I think hasn't responded as of yet is the US. And the Czech Republic, I think. But of those that responded outside of Sweden, every response was thorough. I didn't agree with the responses, but they were thorough, at about 10 to 11 pages. And Sweden's response was a single page, only 2 paragraphs. There were, I think, 4 or 5 paragraphs. 2 were substantive, and both of them deflected the government responsibility. 1 paragraph said, this is really the jurisdiction of municipalities. And the other paragraph said, we believe that housing is a human right, but there are these agreements between tenants, unions, and private landlords, and those agreements are what govern the day. No mention of the role of finance and government's role in regulating finance. So, the government has set up here regulatory structures such that it's lucrative for a Blackstone to come in.
And then the response also becomes that, we recognize that it's a problem everywhere else, but here we have a special Swedish model, so we're not in trouble. Isn't that sort of?
Yeah, I think that's right. This idea of the tenants union negotiating with private landlords and all is well is ridiculous. A tenants union against Blackstone. We could reiterate, Blackstone is the largest, wealthiest private equity firm in the world. So how is a tenant union going to negotiate that without the backing of government and legislation?
I think Blackstone currently owns 21,000 flats in Stockholm. Yeah.
In Sweden.
I'm thinking you are traveling around the world, meeting people in very difficult situations, trying to convince politicians and other stakeholders to listen. What drives you in this work?
Well, that drives me.
It's at...
Housing is such a weird and particular thing. Housing itself, housing policy, is for me incredibly boring. So I rest assured, housing policy does not drive me at all. Human rights drives me. I've learned, strangely, it's taken me a while, but over the last 5 years as rapporteur, I've learned that housing is an incredibly private and intimate thing. When I go into people's homes, I've been granted an incredibly privileged position because they were trusting me to come into what is intimate space, and people are often really embarrassed by their living conditions. Most parents want to be able to provide a really decent and dignified home to their kids, for example. And so when I go in, and I'm saying to them, this doesn't meet human rights standards, in a way I'm critiquing the home. So it's a very sensitive position that I'm in, and very privileged. The way in which people cling to their dignity is probably the biggest motivator. It is phenomenal what people will do to have a semblance of dignity in their own lives. I mean, I've met people living on pavements in India and in the developed world, in Egypt, anyway, many, many places. And the things people do, anyway, pictures often, the way people will hang their laundry, the things women will do to maintain their physical beauty. I'll never forget walking in Skid Row in LA. Horrible. People living on pavements in tents, mostly African American and Hispanic. And I saw this woman sitting outside of her tent. There was garbage all around her not because she's dirty, but because they refuse to collect the garbage. The city refuses to collect the garbage. And she was sitting on a little bench, and she had a compact mirror, and she was plucking her eyebrows. Yeah. I mean, that's pretty motivating.
Yeah, human dignity. I think before we let in the audience, maybe a few words about the shift.
Yeah, so the shift is a global movement that I started with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, which is the highest human rights body within the UN system, and a woman named Kate Gilmore, who's the Deputy High Commissioner. So she's the second most powerful human rights actor in the world. And we joined with another partner called UCLG, United Cities and Local Governments, an entity I didn't know about before I became rapporteur, but they represent about 250,000 local governments, local authorities around the world. And all of us felt that there was a real lack of global voice on issues that we've been talking about today, no global platform to challenge the commodification of housing, and that we needed that. That in fact, around the world, there are a lot of people claiming the right to housing and a lot of governments who actually care about the right to housing. But no platform or umbrella to represent all of that activity or to further and encourage that activity. So we formed this thing called The Shift. And for whatever reason, it resonated with cities right away. So we now have more than 40 cities and one Swedish city, Malmö, that has joined The Shift. And what we've asked cities to do is to commit to implement the right to housing. So the cities that are involved are not human rights compliant right now necessarily. So we have cities like New York, Paris, Berlin, Amsterdam, as I said, Malmö, Copenhagen just joined, Geneva before that, Mexico City, Buenos Aires, Seoul, South Korea. So all of these cities still have a lot of work to do, but what they've said through The Shift is that they're committed to doing that work and to really challenging the financialization of housing and addressing homelessness. We're hoping to get in other actors, and that's where the development world, I think, could play a really important role. You're in a very privileged position. We affect, for example, in 30 countries, right? So you're seeing globally what's happening on the housing front. And to have an entity like the We Effect say, we believe housing is a human right, we know it is, and we're going to work with partners on the ground to further the implementation of the right to housing can be very powerful and can have huge impact. I feel the development world has been a little bit behind. They've come forward on human rights, but not the right to housing. So water and sanitation, for example, huge area in the development world that's understood as a human right. Women's equality sexuality, women's reproductive and health rights, for example, definitely in the development world, understood as human rights. But housing, for some reason, people find it technical, it is boring, and when you look at it from that technical place, you lose that dignity aspect. But, I mean, you can't work with women and not deal with housing, for example.
Thanks for that. I'll take any questions from the audience. And while you're thinking about if you want to ask one, I'm going to ask, you've said that, yes, people are starting to listen, at least in crowds like this, municipalities and so on. Is the UN listening?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's been quite a journey with the UN. So, you know, I'm an independent expert. So I'm appointed by the UN, by states from around the world, but I don't actually work for the UN. So I'm not a UN employee. I'm not paid by the UN, etc. I've seen a huge shift in the conversation on the floor of the Human Rights Council, for example. So that's that highest human rights body within the UN system. So when I first started, states were not talking. They recognize housing as a human right. They have to. They have no choice in that body, in that forum. But now I hear states commonly say, housing's not a commodity. It's not gold. It's a human right. So, and I know where that line's from because that's my line. So someone's listening. When I do my reports, you know, they're required to make interventions. They'll ask me questions. I think things are shifting. It's taking some time. But my own government, for example, I'm from Canada, has been very historically against housing as a human right. They don't want it recognized. In particular, I think they're concerned about Indigenous peoples and what that would mean in a country like Canada, because our Indigenous peoples live in abhorrent housing conditions. In any event, since I became rapporteur, I've been working with our government, and just 2 weeks ago, they adopted legislation that recognizes housing as a fundamental and basic human right. They are going to appoint a new housing advocate whose job will be to implement the right to housing and address systemic barriers to the right to housing. So that's a government that's in 4 years gone from completely, when I first started talking to them, they were like, not wanting to have the conversation. And it took one civil servant who just kind of got it to start working with me, and then she got me into the political realm, and I worked with civil society really closely, and together we managed to do this thing in 4 years. That's a pretty short period of time. Now we have a centrist government. It's not left-wing by any means. And they have not yet tackled financialization, though. But I was told by one of the high-up political people that if they get reelected, they intend to, thanks to the film push, they intend to start addressing financialization. So that's pretty cool, too. And that interaction between, you know, my work, the film, and politics is kind of cool.
Congratulations to you, Canada, and I think to all of us for the inspiration. Are there any questions in the audience?
Hello. My name is Jan Strömdahl. I've been a housing activist and politician for all my life. And 30 years ago, I was active in the UN Habitat in Nairobi and New York, speaking about housing as a human right. But it was just a lot of words about it. Everything was stopped by the US legitimations. And but there were some Indian people trying to push it. Now I'm very impressed of your work and what you can do in the UN environment or UN system. So I hope you will go on with this. And I will say there is one country in the world that I have met who has solved this problem, who had distributed all the dwellings to the people who lives in the dwellings, and without money. And this is Cuba. Cuba has solved this. And I think it could be good for you to make a study tour to Cuba, like all the Canadians who go there as a tourists.
Exactly. I actually requested a mission to Cuba, but they didn't grant it yet. Cuba's interesting, actually, because young people, while it is true that in some ways Cuba solved their housing problem, well, they never had a housing problem because they provided homes to people. Now young people are having difficulties in Cuba, and many of them are not getting married and not leaving home, unable to leave home and start families because they don't have housing and they don't want to live they're not allowed to form informal settlements. So I think historically Cuba was quite good, but I think in the contemporary situation they're struggling as well. Yeah. These days the US is pretty isolated in their position that is very contrary to almost all human rights, not just the right to housing. They take such an obstinate... But because Donald Trump is such a divisive character, they're pretty isolated on the issue of the right to housing. And especially because they have no moral standing when they have more than 500,000 people living in homelessness. And as I said and have drawn a lot of attention to, as has one of my colleagues, the Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty, the situation in the United States is completely dire. I mean, how can you have so many people living literally on the pavement under highways in the 6th largest GDP in the world? I mean, they have no moral ground to stand on at the moment. So, you know, I think if you look at the Democratic leadership race in the US right now, it's pretty interesting. Every single candidate practically has come out to not only say that housing is one of the most significant issues facing the country, but to say that they believe housing is a human right. So that's pretty cool. I mean, they're all saying it with respect to healthcare, that we expected, but I did not expect that so many candidates, Elizabeth Warren, Castro, etc., would be talking about housing as a human right.
Fantastic. And on that note, we actually have to finish or we'll be thrown out. So I want to, and Leilani and Fredrik are here for a few minutes if you want to ask more questions. Just thank you very much for your fantastic work. Keep it up.
Thank you.